Russia is mighty. It has all of the people, the equipment, and the knowledge to take Ukraine down once and for all. And when that happens, Putin will stand as one of the greatest Russian leaders of all time. At least that's what he wants us to think. The reality is much different. Putin is so desperate that he will be forced to end the war within a year. That's the claim made by a former Russian prime minister who was once a Putin ally, but has now been labeled a foreign agent by Russia's dictatorial leader. On July 14th, Times Radio spoke with Mikhail Kasyanov. Between 2000 and 2004, Kasyanov served as Russia's prime minister. If that period seems notable, it's because it covered the first 4 years of Putin's reign as Russia's president. A holdover from the days of former President Boris Yeltsin's administration, Kasyanov soon grew disillusioned with Putin's economic policies. He left the government in 2004 and has since been a thorn in Putin's side. He ran for president in 2008, though he was eventually denied participation on political grounds. Kasyanov has spoken at Russian protests calling for fair elections and was a co-founder of the People's Freedom Party, which stands opposed to Putin. Few people in the world know Putin better than Kasyanov. There are also few people that Putin hates more than his former prime minister. Kasyanov is one of the strongest opposition voices with which Putin has to deal, and in his discussion with Times Radio, Kasyanov makes it clear that he thinks that Putin can't continue the Ukraine war for much longer if he is to have any chance of maintaining his position as Russia's leader. Kasyanov believes that Putin has to surrender within a year. If he doesn't, the former prime minister says, the entire Ukraine war will collapse and Putin's regime may end up falling alongside it. Pressure placed on Putin is the reason he needs to sue for peace, Kasyanov says. And that brings us to the big reasons why Putin stands on the brink of surrender. It all starts with US President Donald Trump. When asked if he believes Trump has the will to stand up to Putin, Kasyanov says that the US president may just play a key role in Putin's surrender. He points to the recent actions that Trump has taken, which will heap a ton of pressure onto Putin's shoulders. First, Donald Trump would finally agree with European colleagues just to sell, not to pass to Ukraine, equipment and ammunition, but to sell for money. That will be a reinvigoration of new supplies to Ukraine. That's a good thing to do this, Kasyanov says. The former Russian prime minister is referring to a deal Trump reportedly struck with America's NATO allies in mid-July. The New York Times reported on that deal, noting that Trump announced it during an interview in the White House alongside NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte. According to Trump, NATO is going to start buying weapons from the US, which can then be quickly distributed to the battlefield, so Ukraine can use them to defend itself against Putin's forces. The move came amidst Trump expressing his frustration with Putin for failing to take part in peace talks. "I'm disappointed in President Putin because I thought we would have had a deal 2 months ago, but it doesn't seem to get there," Trump said when announcing the deal. Trump added, "My conversations with him are very pleasant, and then missiles go off at night. He's fooled a lot of people. He fooled Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden. He didn't fool me." The deal is done. It's fully approved. Soon, US-made weapons will come flooding into Ukraine courtesy of the country's NATO allies. Trump claims this will amount to really massive numbers of military equipment, though the specific mechanisms and what Ukraine will be receiving haven't been revealed yet. Kasyanov hopes that bureaucracy won't hold up the deal. Hopefully it won't take much time to provide Ukraine with the necessary equipment and Patriot systems in particular. What we see here is pressure. Kasyanov believes that the pressure placed on Putin by this new weapons deal will contribute to Russia's leader being forced to sue for peace. The logic is sound. During the summer, Putin has launched a fresh offensive against Ukraine that has seen Russia dedicate 50,000 troops to creating a buffer zone in Sumy, along with over 110,000 sent to Donetsk, with the goal of taking Pokrovsk. Alongside that ground offensive, Putin has also been launching record numbers of drones and missiles at Ukraine's cities. Success for Putin this summer relies on Ukraine having limited or no access to the sorts of advanced defense systems that could stop the offensive in its tracks. Trump's announcement suggests that Ukraine will have the weapons it needs. Putin's offensive will stall amid thousands of Russian soldiers and hundreds of units of military equipment being destroyed. Yet another failure among a cavalcade of the many others seen since Putin launched his invasion will put more pressure on Putin to end the war. And if that doesn't work, there's also the secondary tariffs that Trump threatened in mid-July. Along with the new NATO deal, Trump also announced that he's giving Putin 50 days as of July 14th to agree a new deal with Ukraine, or the US will impose secondary sanctions on Russia. The idea here is simple. The US can't really hurt Russia with direct tariffs right now. Trade between the two countries is too low for that to happen. The United States Trade Representative points out that only $3.5 billion of trade occurred between the US and Russia in 2024, which is a tiny amount given the size of the two nations. If direct tariffs won't work, secondary tariffs are how Trump intends to hurt Putin. Under this plan, any country that buys from Russia will be hit with tariffs that make it harder for those countries to trade with the US. It's a rock and a hard place situation. Every affected country will be forced into making the difficult decision between continuing to trade with Russia despite the US tariffs or abandoning Russia altogether. Trump hopes most will make the latter choice, which will put a severe dent in Russia's economy. Speaking of Russia's economy, Kasyanov also covered the impact that Western sanctions have had on Russia and Putin's war effort. Initially, Kasyanov says, the sanctions didn't create the impact the West had hoped. Individual sanctions, just all those packages which were imposed during the 3-year period, just didn't create immediate effect, didn't enforce Putin to stop the war. We know that. Putin is still pushing on even though Russia is laboring under 24,311 sanctions, 21,692 of which were put in place after Putin launched his invasion. However, sanctions did heap yet more pressure on Putin's shoulders, and that pressure is starting to be felt throughout the Russian economy, as Kasyanov explains. They created a major problem for the country, and just a cumulative effect over a 3-year period of time right now in the place, and Putin feels that this is getting more and more difficult. By the end of this year, it will be even more difficult, and even already his ministers are warning him about that. Russia's banks are certainly scared about what the future holds for Russia's economy. On June 26th, Bloomberg reported that Russia's banks have privately rang alarm bells over the number of their corporate and retail clients who are failing to make their loan repayments. High interest rates are to blame, the outlet says, as Russia struggles with a 20% interest rate that's making it almost impossible for businesses to take out loans. There is a growing risk of a debt crisis exploding in Russia, Bloomberg reports Russian banking officials are stating. Plus, the bank's loan portfolios are starting to collapse. One estimate showed that the corporate loan portfolio by Russian banks in the first 2 months of 2025 decreased by 1.5 trillion rubles, $19 billion, before stabilizing, Bloomberg says. Warnings of economic recession loom large in Russia. Nerves are shaky, causing tensions to run high, and part of the reason, according to Bruegel, is that Putin has militarized Russia's economy. Prioritizing defense, particularly in manufacturing, has led to the creation of an unsustainable economic model. Product creation outside of defense is tanking, reducing Russia's income from exports as its manufacturing might is dedicated to producing the weapons the country's soldiers need to keep pushing against Ukraine. That transformation was good for Russia's economy at first. Even in 2024, Bruegel points out, Russia reported growth of 4.1%, but the first quarter of 2025 saw just 1.4% growth, which amounts to a 0.6% contraction in economic activity compared to the previous quarter. Therein lies Putin's problem. The changes he's made to Russia's economy were fine for a short term, when he thought his forces could overcome Ukraine in just a couple of years. Now that hasn't happened. Economic problems are starting to rear their heads. The sanctions Kasyanov mentions are having an impact. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, even says that sanctions have reshaped Russia's economic future. The sanctions imposed by coalition nations have unequivocally impaired Russia's economic capabilities, constraining its capacity to sustain its military endeavors in Ukraine. In 2022, Russia's GDP experienced a contraction of 2.1%, and while it was able to regain growth as the war dragged on, this growth was the result of its shift to a war economy built on the production, followed by destruction, of weapons of war, CSIS points out. The resilience Russia's economy has shown during the first 3 years of the war that Putin started was impressive, but Russia's economic stamina has run out. We can now see that in trade statistics, along with Russia's economic contraction. On July 14th, the Moscow Times reported that trade between Russia and China fell by 9% during the first half of 2025. While it may not seem like a huge amount, China has been a lifeline for Putin. It's China that stepped up to start buying Russian oil in record amounts when Western sanctions made it difficult for Putin to sell elsewhere. A reduction in trade now, over 3 years into the war, is the last thing Putin wants as he scrambles to continue his invasion. Speaking about oil, the numbers aren't looking much better on that front. In June, Bloomberg reported that Russia's oil revenue had fallen to a 2-year low. Putin was only able to claim $5.5 billion in oil-related taxes in May 2025, which was a 32% decline from the amount claimed a year prior. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air also reports that Russia's overall fossil fuel revenue declined by 18% during the second quarter of 2025, and that revenue decline happened even though Russia sold 8% more oil in the first quarter of 2025. These economic problems are bad news for Putin. They also explain why Russia's leader is throwing all of his eggs into the summer offensive basket. That's why Putin would like to press and to have an offensive operation now just effective so that within these several months, while he still feels financially quite stable, just to press Ukraine, to destroy Ukraine, Kasyanov explains. Putin has to push now because he might not be able to in the future. Oil could be the key. The situation could change if the price cap for oil would be really implemented and controlled. In this case, just the inflow of revenue to the federal budget of Putin, Kasyanov tells Times Radio. It will reduce Putin's ability to finance. That's the problem he's already facing. And it's a problem that's only going to get worse for Russia's leader. Just 4 days after Kasyanov spoke to Times Radio, the UK and European Union agreed on a new price cap that will lower what Russia can charge for a barrel of seaborne oil from $60 to $47.60. The European Union also plans to implement a moving cap that it says will always be 15% lower than the average market price for Urals crude, which is Russia's main oil blend. What we have here are two forms of pressure. On the Trump front, Putin is dealing with the dual problem of the new NATO agreement and the threat of secondary sanctions in a little over a month. That's immense pressure being placed on Russia's leader. The secondary sanctions also feed into the pressure being created by Russia's economic problems, which are pushing Putin closer to the brink of having to give up on his invasion unless he wants his entire country to suffer the consequences. And there's even more pressure. Russia is dealing with a severe manpower crisis. The wartime economy we mentioned earlier has created a ton of manpower problems inside Russia. Putin now requires a war for his country's economy to function. That's a problem, as Kasyanov explains. Growing problems would not allow just to have such a system, such a model, for a long time. Just the problem with manpower. Putin has no people to work. All people now just transfer from civilian industries to military industry. This is a problem that's plagued Russia since Putin launched his full-scale invasion and is coming to a head in 2025. In February, Le Monde Diplomatique noted that Russia has a labor shortage of around 5 million people, which is approximately 6.8% of the country's active population. A combination of Putin's war and Russia's declining birth rate is to blame. Russia has been forced to close the workforce gap by welcoming more immigrant workers into the fold. That's a short-term solution. Russia's labor minister Anton Kotyakov revealed the extent of the problem on July 14th, right when Kasyanov was giving his interview. By 2030, we will need to integrate 10.9 million people into the economy. About 800,000 new jobs will be created, and about 10.1 million people will have reached retirement age, he said. In other words, Putin faces both a manpower problem and a demographic crisis. Unemployment in Russia is also at a record low of 2.2%, United 24 Media says. That might seem like a good thing on the surface, but these low unemployment figures are cast in a new light when you learn that Russia has thousands of jobs that its civilian companies can't fill because there aren't enough people to go around. Civilian industries already just in reduction, already contracting, Kasyanov tells Times Radio. The first quarter official figures show that the civilian industry is already just contracting. That's the problem he also has during this year. And it's going to get worse. A completely different situation will have emerged by the end of 2025, Kasyanov says. A situation that will have Putin hanging on by the skin of his teeth if he doesn't sue for peace. Times Radio then asks the direct question of Kasyanov. Will Putin be forced into peace by all of this pressure, preventing him from doing what he's been doing for the last 3 years? Kasyanov says that it will. If pressure will increase on Putin's regime, as I mentioned, just on these two directions, then Putin will sue for peace by the end of 2025. Beyond the pressure Putin already faces, Kasyanov explains, even more could be heaped on his shoulders if the United States approves a bill put forth by Senator Lindsey Graham. That bill is essentially an even more impactful version of the secondary tariffs Trump has threatened to implement if Putin doesn't agree to peace within 50 days. The bill calls for a tariff of at least 500% relative to the value of whatever goods and services a country buys from Russia. Again, bear in mind that it's not Russia that will pay this tariff, it's the countries that buy from Russia. Graham believes his bill would give Trump a sledgehammer he can use to batter Putin, marking a turning point in the Ukraine war. Will Graham's bill pass into law? We don't know yet. But we do know that it would pile on yet more pressure on a Russian leader whose knees are already buckling from the weight that's on his shoulders. All of this leads us to what happens in the future. Times Radio brings up Putin's repeated threats against NATO and the possibility that Russia might invade a NATO nation if Putin is victorious in Ukraine. The Guardian says Rutte has already suggested that Russia could be ready to attack a NATO nation within 5 years of June 2025, which is one of the reasons why NATO has raised its defense spending recommendations to 5% of gross domestic product. Kasyanov says this will only occur if Putin is victorious in Ukraine. I believe that such a situation could be real only if the West would allow Putin to destroy Ukraine, he tells Times Radio. And if Putin would get this victorious war against Ukraine, then he will immediately eat Moldova, which is a nearby small country, and then he will try to test Article 5 of the NATO Charter, whether this article works or not. Under Article 5, each NATO member is duty-bound to come to the aid of any other member that experiences a direct attack on its territorial sovereignty. The only thing that will stop Putin's attempts to test NATO is Ukraine standing up to him. If Ukraine stands firm, Putin doesn't feel emboldened. He doesn't get to feel confident that he could take on any NATO member, even a small nation like Estonia or Lithuania. Instead, he learns that NATO and the collective West will stand against him to support Ukraine. And if Ukraine is supported with military aid and all of the pressures being placed on Russia, Putin will be forced to realize that it will strike Russia more directly if he's foolish enough to attack a NATO nation. Kasyanov's comments reveal that Russia's president is in an ever-weakening position. The pressure placed on him already by sanctions is wrecking Russia's economy. More pressure in the form of the US deal and NATO and secondary sanctions would collapse his regime entirely. Putin will be forced to sue for peace, not because he wants to, but because 3.5 years of war and the pressure placed on his country will force him. Russia's looming economic crisis is the biggest problem Putin has to handle if he hopes not to have to sue for peace. Frankly, it's the true reason that Russia can never win this war. Find out more in our video, where we take a deep dive into just how much Putin's approach has damaged his country's economy. And if you like this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Putin's weakening situation as Russia's president. And thank you, as always, for watching.